The Sceptic, by David Hume. I have long entertained a suspicion with regard to the decisions of philosophers upon all subjects, and found in myself a greater inclination to dispute than assent to their conclusions. There is one mistake to which they seem liable, almost without exception. They confine too much their principles and make no account of that vast variety which nature has so much affected in all her operations. When a philosopher has once laid hold of a favorite principle, which perhaps accounts for many natural effects, he extends the same principle over the whole creation, and reduces to it every phenomenon, though by the most violent and absurd reasoning. Our own mind being narrow and contracted, we cannot extend our conception to the variety and extent of nature, but imagine that she is as much bounded in her operations as we are in our speculation. But if ever this infirmity of philosophers is to be suspected on any occasion, it is in their reasonings concerning human life and the methods of attaining happiness. In that case, they are led astray, not only by the narrowness of their understandings, but by that also of their passions. Almost everyone has a predominant inclination, to which his other desires and affections submit, and which governs him, though, perhaps, with some intervals, through the whole course of his life. It is difficult for him to apprehend that anything which appears totally indifferent to him can ever give enjoyment to any person, or can possess charms which altogether escape his observation. His own pursuits are always, in his account, the most engaging, the objects of his passion the most valuable, and the road which he pursues the only one that leads to happiness. But would these prejudiced reasoners reflect a moment, there are many obvious instances and arguments sufficient to undeceive them and make them enlarge their maxims and principles. Do they not see the vast variety of inclinations and pursuits among our species, where each man seems fully satisfied with his own course of life, and would esteem it the greatest unhappiness to be confined to that of his neighbor? Do they not feel in themselves that what pleases at one time displeases at another by the change of inclination, and that it is not in their power, by their utmost efforts, to recall that taste or appetite which formerly bestowed charms on what now appears indifferent or disagreeable? What is the meaning, therefore, of those general preferences of the town or country life, of a life of action or one of pleasure, of retirement or society, when besides the different inclinations of different men, everyone's experience may convince him that each of these kinds of life is agreeable in its turn, and that their variety or their judicious mixture chiefly contributes to the rendering all of them agreeable? But shall this business be allowed to go altogether at adventures? And must a man consult only his humor and inclination in order to determine his course of life, without employing his reason to inform him what road is preferable and leads most surely to happiness? Is there no difference then between one man's conduct and another? I answer, there is a great difference. One man, following his inclination, in choosing his course of life, may employ much surer means for succeeding than another, who is led by his inclination into the same course of life, and pursues the same object. Are riches the chief object of your desires? Acquire skill in your profession, be diligent in the exercise of it. Enlarge the circle of your friends and acquaintance, avoid pleasure and expense, and never be generous, but with a view of gaining more than you could save by frugality. Would you acquire the public esteem? Guard equally against the extremes of arrogance and fawning. Let it appear that you set a value upon yourself, but without despising others. If you fall into either of the extremes, you either provoke men's pride by your insolence, or teach them to despise you by your timorous submission and by the mean opinion which you seem to entertain of yourself. These, you say, are the maxims of common prudence and discretion, what every parent inculcates on his child, and what every man of sense pursues in the course of life, which he has chosen. What is it then you desire more? Do you come to a philosopher as to a cunning man, to learn something by magic or witchcraft, beyond what can be known by common prudence and discretion? Yes, we come to a philosopher to be instructed, how we shall choose our ends more than the means for attaining these ends. We want to know what desire we shall gratify, what passion we shall comply with, what appetite we shall indulge. As to the rest, we trust to common sense and the general maxims of the world for our instruction. I am sorry, then, I have pretended to be a philosopher, for I find your questions very perplexing, and am in danger, if my answer be too rigid and severe, of passing for a pedant and scholastic, if it be too easy and free, of being taken for a preacher of vice and immorality. However, to satisfy you, I shall deliver my opinion upon the matter, and shall only desire you to esteem it of as little consequence as I do myself. By that means you will neither think it worthy of your ridicule nor your anger. If we can depend upon any principle which we learn from philosophy, this I think may be considered as certain and undoubted, that there is nothing in itself, valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed, but that these attributes arise from the particular constitution and fabric of human sentiment and affection. What seems the most delicious food to one animal appears loathsome to another. What affects the feeling of one with delight produces uneasiness in another. This is confessedly the case with regard to all the bodily senses. But if we examine the matter more accurately, we shall find that the same observation holds even where the mind concurs with the body, and mingles its sentiment with the exterior appetite. Desire this passionate lover to give you a character of his mistress. He will tell you that he is at a loss for words to describe her charms, and will ask you very seriously if ever you were acquainted with a goddess or an angel. If you answer that you never were, he will then say that it is impossible for you to form a conception of such divine beauties as those which his charmer possesses, so complete a shape, such well-proportioned features, so engaging an air, such sweetness of disposition, such gaiety of humor. You can infer nothing, however, from all this discourse, but that the poor man is in love, and that the general appetite between the sexes, which nature has infused into all animals, is in him determined to a particular object by some qualities which give him pleasure. The same divine creature, not only to a different animal, but also to a different man, appears a mere mortal being, and is beheld with the utmost indifference. Nature has given all animals a like prejudice in favor of their offspring. As soon as the helpless infant sees the light, though in every other eye it appears a despicable and a miserable creature, it is regarded by its fond parent with the utmost affection, and is preferred to every other object, however perfect and accomplished. The passion alone, arising from the original structure and formation of human nature, bestows a value on the most insignificant object. We may push the same observation further, and may conclude that even when the mind operates alone, and feeling the sentiment of blame or approbation, pronounces one object deformed and odious, another beautiful and amiable, I say that, even in this case, those qualities are not really in the objects, but belong entirely to the sentiment of that mind which blames or praises. I grant that it will be more difficult to make this proposition evident, and as it were, palpable, to negligent thinkers, because nature is more uniform in the sentiments of the mind than in most feelings of the body, and produces a nearer resemblance in the inward than in the outward part of humankind. There is something approaching to principles in mental taste, and critics can reason and dispute more plausibly than cooks or perfumers. We may observe, however, that this uniformity among humankind hinders not, but that there is a considerable diversity in the sentiments of beauty and worth, and that education, custom, prejudice, caprice, and humor frequently vary our taste of this kind. You will never convince a man who is not accustomed to Italian music and has not an ear to follow its intricacies that a Scotch tune is not preferable. You have not even any single argument beyond your own taste which you can employ in your behalf, and to your antagonist, his particular taste will always appear a more convincing argument to the contrary. If you be wise, each of you will allow that the other may be in the right, and having many other instances of this diversity of taste, you will both confess that beauty and worth are merely of a relative nature, and consist in an agreeable sentiment produced by an object in a particular mind, according to the peculiar structure and constitution of that mind. By this diversity of sentiment, observable in humankind, nature has, perhaps, intended to make us sensible of her authority, and let us see what surprising changes she could produce on the passions and desires of mankind, merely by the change of their inward fabric, without any alteration on the objects. The vulgar may even be convinced by this argument, but men, accustomed to thinking, may draw a more convincing, at least a more general argument from the very nature of the subject. In the operation of reasoning, the mind does nothing but run over its objects, as they are supposed to stand in reality, without adding anything to them, or diminishing anything from them. If I examine the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems, I endeavor only, by my inquiries, to know the real situation of the planets. That is, in other words, I endeavor to give them, in my conception, the same relations that they bear towards each other in the heavens. To this operation of the mind, therefore, there seems to be always a real, though often an unknown standard in the nature of things, nor is truth or falsehood variable by the various apprehensions of mankind, though all human race should forever conclude that the sun moves and the earth remains at rest. The sun stirs not an inch from his place for all these reasonings, and such conclusions are eternally false and erroneous. But the case is not the same with the qualities of beautiful and deformed, desirable and odious, as with truth and falsehood. In the former case, the mind is not content with merely surveying its objects as they stand in themselves. It also feels a sentiment of delight or uneasiness, approbation or blame consequent to that survey, and this sentiment determines it to affix the epithet beautiful or deformed, desirable or odious. Now it is evident that this sentiment must depend upon the particular fabric or structure of the mind, which enables such particular forms to operate in such a particular manner, and produces a sympathy or conformity between the mind and its objects. Vary the structure of the mind or inward organs, the sentiment no longer follows, though the form remains the same. The sentiment being different from the object and arising from its operation upon the organs of the mind, an alteration upon the latter must vary the effect, nor can the same object presented to a mind totally different produce the same sentiment. This conclusion everyone is apt to draw of himself, without much philosophy, where the sentiment is evidently distinguishable from the object. Who is not sensible that power and glory and vengeance are not desirable of themselves, but derive all their value from the structure of human passions, which begets a desire towards such particular pursuits? But with regard to beauty, either natural or moral, the case is commonly supposed to be different. The agreeable quality is thought to lie in the object, not in the sentiment, and that merely because the sentiment is not so turbulent and violent as to distinguish itself in an evident manner from the perception of the object. But a little reflection suffices to distinguish them. A man may know exactly all the circles and ellipses of the Copernican system, and all the irregular spirals of the Ptolemaic, without perceiving that the former is more beautiful than the latter. Euclid has fully explained every quality of the circle, but has not in any proposition said a word of its beauty. The reason is evident. Beauty is not a quality of the circle. It lies not in any part of the line whose parts are all equally distant from a common center. It is only the effect which that figure produces upon a mind, whose particular fabric or structure renders it susceptible of such sentiments. In vain would you look for it in the circle, or seek it, either by your senses or by mathematical reasonings, in all the properties of that figure. The mathematician, who took no other pleasure in reading Virgil, but that of examining Aeneas's voyage by the map, might perfectly understand the meaning of every Latin word employed by that divine author, and consequently might have a distinct idea of the whole narration. He would even have a more distinct idea of it than they could attain who had not studied so exactly the geography of the poem. He knew, therefore, everything in the poem, but he was ignorant of its beauty, because the beauty, properly speaking, lies not in the poem, but in the sentiment or taste of the reader. And where a man has no such delicacy of temper as to make him feel this sentiment, he must be ignorant of the beauty, though possessed of the science and understanding of an angel. The inference upon the whole is, that it is not from the value or worth of the object, which any person pursues, that we can determine his enjoyment, but merely from the passion with which he pursues it, and the success which he meets with in his pursuit. Objects have absolutely no worth or value in themselves. They derive their worth merely from the passion. If that be strong and steady and successful, the person is happy. It cannot reasonably be doubted, but a little miss, dressed in a new gown for a dancing school ball, receives as complete enjoyment as the greatest orator who triumphs in the splendor of his eloquence, while he governs the passions and resolutions of a numerous assembly. All the difference, therefore, between one man and another, with regard to life, consists either in the passion or in the enjoyment, and these differences are sufficient to produce the wide extremes of happiness and misery. To be happy, the passion must neither be too violent nor too remiss. In the first case, the mind is in a perpetual hurry and tumult. In the second, it sinks into a disagreeable indolence and lethargy. To be happy, the passion must be benign and social, not rough or fierce. The affections of the latter kind are not near so agreeable to the feeling as those of the former. Who will compare rancor and animosity, envy and revenge, to friendship, benignity, clemency, and gratitude? To be happy, the passion must be cheerful and gay, not gloomy and melancholy. A propensity to hope and joy is real riches, one to fear and sorrow, real poverty. Some passions or inclinations, in the enjoyment of their object, are not so steady or constant as others, nor convey such durable pleasure and satisfaction. Philosophical devotion, for instance, like the enthusiasm of a poet, is the transitory effect of high spirits, great leisure, a fine genius, and a habit of study and contemplation. But notwithstanding all these circumstances, an abstract, invisible object, like that which natural religion alone presents to us, cannot long actuate the mind or be of any moment in life. To render the passion of continuance, we must find some method of affecting the senses and imagination, and must embrace some historical, as well as philosophical account of the divinity. Popular superstitions and observances are even found to be of use in this particular. Though the tempers of men be very different, yet we may safely pronounce in general that a life of pleasure cannot support itself so long as one of business, but is much more subject to satiety and disgust. The amusements, which are the most durable, have all a mixture of application and attention in them, such as gaming and hunting, and in general, business and action fill up all the great vacancies in human life. But where the temper is the best disposed for any enjoyment, the object is often wanting, and in this respect, the passions, which pursue external objects, contribute not so much to happiness as those which rest in ourselves, since we are neither so certain of attaining such objects, nor so secure in possessing them. A passion for learning is preferable, with regard to happiness, to one for riches. Some men are possessed of great strength of mind, and even when they pursue external objects are not much affected by a disappointment, but renew their application and industry with the greatest cheerfulness. Nothing contributes more to happiness than such a turn of mind. According to this short and imperfect sketch of human life, the happiest disposition of mind is the virtuous, or in other words, that which leads to action and employment, renders us sensible to the social passions, steels the heart against the assaults of fortune, reduces the affections to a just moderation, makes our own thoughts an entertainment to us, and inclines us rather to the pleasures of society and conversation than to those of the senses. This, in the meantime, must be obvious to the most careless reasoner, that all dispositions of mind are not alike favorable to happiness, and that one passion or humor may be extremely desirable, while another is equally disagreeable. And indeed, all the difference between the conditions of life depends upon the mind, nor is there any one situation of affairs in itself preferable to another. Good and ill, both natural and moral, are entirely relative to human sentiment and affection. No man would ever be unhappy could he alter his feelings. Proteus-like, he would elude all attacks by the continual alterations of his shape and form. But of this resource nature has in a great measure deprived us. The fabric and constitution of our mind no more depends on our choice than that of our body. The generality of men have not even the smallest notion that any alteration in this respect can ever be desirable. As a stream necessarily follows the several inclinations of the ground on which it runs, so are the ignorant and thoughtless part of mankind actuated by their natural propensities. Such are effectually excluded from all pretensions to philosophy, and the medicine of the mind so much boasted. But even upon the wise and thoughtful, nature has a prodigious influence, nor is it always in a man's power by the utmost art and industry to correct his temper and attain that virtuous character to which he aspires. The empire of philosophy extends over a few, and with regard to these two, her authority is very weak and limited. Men may well be sensible of the value of virtue, and may desire to attain it, but it is not always certain that they will be successful in their wishes. Whoever considers without prejudice the course of human actions will find that mankind are almost entirely guided by constitution and temper, and that general maxims have little influence but so far as they affect our taste or sentiment. If a man have a lively sense of honor and virtue, with moderate passions, his conduct will always be conformable to the rules of morality, or if he depart from them, his return will be easy and expeditious. On the other hand, where one is born of so perverse a frame of mind, of so callous and insensible a disposition, as to have no relish for virtue and humanity, no sympathy with his fellow creatures, no desire of esteem and applause, such a one must be allowed entirely incurable, nor is there any remedy in philosophy. He reaps no satisfaction but from low and sensual objects, or from the indulgence of malignant passions. He feels no remorse to control his vicious inclinations. He has not even that sense or taste which is requisite to make him desire a better character. For my part, I know not how I should address myself to such a one, or by what arguments I should endeavor to reform him. Should I tell him of the inward satisfaction which results from laudable and humane actions, the delicate pleasure of disinterested love and friendship, the lasting enjoyments of a good name and an established character, he might still reply that these were, perhaps, pleasures to such as were susceptible of them, but that, for his part, he finds himself of a quite different turn and disposition. I must repeat it. My philosophy affords no remedy in such a case, nor could I do anything but lament this person's unhappy condition. But then I ask, if any other philosophy can afford a remedy, or if it be possible by any system to render all mankind virtuous, however perverse may be their natural frame of mind. Experience will soon convince us of the contrary, and I will venture to affirm that perhaps the chief benefit which results from philosophy arises in an indirect manner, and proceeds more from its secret, insensible influence than from its immediate application. It is certain that a serious attention to the sciences and liberal arts softens and humanizes the temper, and cherishes those fine emotions in which true virtue and honor consists. It rarely, very rarely happens that a man of taste and learning is not at least an honest man, whatever frailties may attend him. The bent of his mind to speculative studies must mortify in him the passions of interest and ambition, and must at the same time give him a greater sensibility of all the decencies and duties of life. He feels more fully a moral distinction in characters and manners, nor is his sense of this kind diminished, but, on the contrary, it is much increased by speculation. Besides such insensible changes upon the temper and disposition, it is highly probable that others may be produced by study and application. The prodigious effects of education may convince us that the mind is not altogether stubborn and inflexible, but will admit of many alterations from its original make and structure. Let a man propose to himself the model of a character, which he approves. Let him be well acquainted with those particulars in which his own character deviates from this model. Let him keep a constant watch over himself, and bend his mind, by a continual effort, from the vices towards the virtues, and I doubt not but, in time, he will find in his temper an alteration for the better. Habit is another powerful means of reforming the mind, and implanting in it good dispositions and inclinations. A man who continues in a course of sobriety and temperance will hate riot and disorder. If he engage in business or study, indolence will seem a punishment to him. If he constrain himself to practice beneficence and affability, he will soon abhor all instances of pride and violence, where one is thoroughly convinced that the virtuous course of life is preferable. If he have but resolution enough for some time to impose a violence on himself, his reformation needs not be despaired of. The misfortune is that this conviction and this resolution never can have place, unless a man be, beforehand, tolerably virtuous. Here, then, is the chief triumph of art and philosophy. It insensibly refines the temper, and it points out to us those dispositions which we should endeavor to attain by a constant bent of mind and by repeated habit. Beyond this I cannot acknowledge it to have great influence, and I must entertain doubts concerning all those exhortations and consolations which are in such vogue among speculative reasoners. We have already observed that no objects are, in themselves, desirable or odious, valuable or despicable, but that objects acquire these qualities from the particular character and constitution of the mind, which surveys them. To diminish, therefore, or augment any person's value for an object, to excite or moderate his passions, there are no direct arguments or reasons which can be employed with any force or influence. The catching of flies, like Domitian, if it give more pleasure, is preferable to the hunting of wild beasts, like William Rufus, or conquering of kingdoms, like Alexander. But though the value of every object can be determined only by the sentiment or passion of every individual, we may observe that the passion, in pronouncing its verdict, considers not the object simply as it is in itself, but surveys it with all the circumstances which attend it. A man transported with joy on account of his possessing a diamond confines not his view to the glistering stone before him. He also considers its rarity, and thence chiefly arises his pleasure and exultation. Here, therefore, a philosopher may step in and suggest particular views and considerations and circumstances, which otherwise would have escaped us. And by that means, he may either moderate or excite any particular passion. It may seem unreasonable absolutely to deny the authority of philosophy in this respect. But it must be confessed that there lies this strong presumption against it, that if these views be natural and obvious, they would have occurred of themselves, without the assistance of philosophy. If they be not natural, they never can have any influence on the affections. These are of a very delicate nature, and cannot be forced or constrained by the utmost art or industry. A consideration which we seek for on purpose, which we enter into with difficulty, which we cannot retain without care and attention, will never produce those genuine and durable movements of passion which are the result of nature and the constitution of the mind. A man may as well pretend to cure himself of love by viewing his mistress through the artificial medium of a microscope or prospect, and beholding there the coarseness of her skin and monstrous disproportion of her features, as hope to excite or moderate any passion by the artificial arguments of a Seneca or an Epictetus. The remembrance of the natural aspect and situation of the object will, in both cases, still recur upon him. The reflections of philosophy are too subtle and distant to take place in common life, or eradicate any affection. The air is too fine to breathe in, where it is above the winds and clouds of the atmosphere. Another defect of those refined reflections, which philosophy suggests to us, is that commonly they cannot diminish or extinguish our vicious passions, without diminishing or extinguishing such as are virtuous, and rendering the mind totally indifferent and unactive. They are, for the most part, general, and are applicable to all our affections. In vain do we hope to direct their influence only to one side. If by incessant study and meditation we have rendered them intimate and present to us, they will operate throughout and spread an universal insensibility over the mind. When we destroy the nerves, we extinguish the sense of pleasure, together with that of pain, in the human body. It will be easy by one glance of the eye to find one or other of these defects in most of those philosophical reflections, so much celebrated both in ancient and modern times. Let not the injuries or violence of men, say the philosophers, ever discompose you by anger or hatred. Would you be angry at the ape for its malice, or the tiger for its ferocity? This reflection leads us into a bad opinion of human nature, and must extinguish the social affections. It tends also to prevent all remorse for a man's own crimes, when he considers that vice is as natural to mankind as the particular instincts to brute creatures. All ills arise from the order of the universe, which is absolutely perfect. Would you wish to disturb so divine an order for the sake of your own particular interest? What if the ills I suffer arise from malice or oppression? But the vices and imperfections of men are also comprehended in the order of the universe. If plagues and earthquakes break not heaven's design, why then a Borgia or a Catiline? Let this be allowed, and my own vices will also be a part of the same order. To one who said that none were happy, who were not above opinion, a Spartan replied, "Then none are happy but knaves and robbers." Man is born to be miserable, and is he surprised at any particular misfortune? And can he give way to sorrow and lamentation upon account of any disaster? Yes, he very reasonably laments that he should be born to be miserable. Your consolation presents 100 ills for one, of which you pretend to ease him. You should always have before your eyes death, disease, poverty, blindness, exile, calumny, and infamy as ills which are incident to human nature. If any one of these ills falls to your lot, you will bear it the better when you have reckoned upon it. I answer, if we confine ourselves to a general and distant reflection on the ills of human life, that can have no effect to prepare us for them. If by close and intense meditation we render them present and intimate to us, that is the true secret for poisoning all our pleasures and rendering us perpetually miserable. Your sorrow is fruitless, and will not change the course of destiny. Very true, and for that very reason I am sorry. Cicero's consolation for deafness is somewhat curious. How many languages are there, says he, which you do not understand? The Punic, Spanish, Gallic, Egyptian, etc. With regard to all these, you are as if you were deaf, yet you are indifferent about the matter. Is it then so great a misfortune to be deaf to one language more? I like better the repartee of Antipater the Cyrenaic, when some women were condoling with him for his blindness. What, says he, do you think there are no pleasures in the dark? Nothing can be more destructive, says Fontenelle, to ambition and the passion for conquest than the true system of astronomy. What a poor thing is even the whole globe in comparison of the infinite extent of nature. This consideration is evidently too distant ever to have any effect. Or, if it had any, would it not destroy patriotism as well as ambition? The same gallant author adds with some reason that the bright eyes of the ladies are the only objects, which lose nothing of their luster or value from the most extensive views of astronomy, but stand proof against every system. Would philosophers advise us to limit our affection to them? Exile, says Plutarch to a friend in banishment, is no evil. Mathematicians tell us that the whole earth is but a point compared to the heavens. To change one's country then is little more than to remove from one street to another. Man is not a plant, rooted to a certain spot of earth. All soils and all climates are alike suited to him. These topics are admirable, could they fall only into the hands of banished persons. But what if they come also to the knowledge of those who are employed in public affairs, and destroy all their attachment to their native country? Or will they operate like the quack's medicine, which is equally good for a diabetes and a dropsy? It is certain were a superior being thrust into a human body, that the whole of life would to him appear so mean, contemptible, and puerile, that he never could be induced to take part in anything, and would scarcely give attention to what passes around him. To engage him to such a condescension as to play even the part of a Philip with zeal and alacrity would be much more difficult than to constrain the same Philip, after having been a king and a conqueror during 50 years, to mend old shoes with proper care and attention, the occupation which Lucian assigns him in the infernal regions. Now all the same topics of disdain towards human affairs, which could operate on this supposed being, occur also to a philosopher, but being, in some measure, disproportioned to human capacity, and not being fortified by the experience of anything better, they make not a full impression on him. He sees, but he feels not sufficiently their truth, and is always a sublime philosopher, when he needs not, that is, as long as nothing disturbs him or rouses his affections. While others play, he wonders at their keenness and ardor, but he no sooner puts in his own stake than he is commonly transported with the same passions that he had so much condemned while he remained a simple spectator. There are two considerations chiefly to be met with in books of philosophy, from which any important effect is to be expected, and that because these considerations are drawn from common life and occur upon the most superficial view of human affairs. When we reflect on the shortness and uncertainty of life, how despicable seem all our pursuits of happiness, and even if we would extend our concern beyond our own life, how frivolous appear our most enlarged and most generous projects, when we consider the incessant changes and revolutions of human affairs, by which laws and learning, books and governments are hurried away by time as by a rapid stream, and are lost in the immense ocean of matter. Such a reflection certainly tends to mortify all our passions, but does it not thereby counterwork the artifice of nature, who has happily deceived us into an opinion that human life is of some importance? And may not such a reflection be employed with success by voluptuous reasoners, in order to lead us from the paths of action and virtue into the flowery fields of indolence and pleasure? We are informed by Thucydides that during the famous plague of Athens, when death seemed present to everyone, a dissolute mirth and gaiety prevailed among the people, who exhorted one another to make the most of life as long as it endured. The same observation is made by Boccace with regard to the plague of Florence. A like principle makes soldiers during war be more addicted to riot and expense than any other race of men. Present pleasure is always of importance, and whatever diminishes the importance of all other objects must bestow on it an additional influence and value. The second philosophical consideration, which may often have an influence on the affections, is derived from a comparison of our own condition with the condition of others. This comparison we are continually making, even in common life, but the misfortune is that we are rather apt to compare our situation with that of our superiors than with that of our inferiors. A philosopher corrects this natural infirmity by turning his view to the other side, in order to render himself easy in the situation to which fortune has confined him. There are few people who are not susceptible of some consolation from this reflection, though, to a very good-natured man, the view of human miseries should rather produce sorrow than comfort, and add, to his lamentations for his own misfortunes, a deep compassion for those of others. Such is the imperfection, even of the best of these philosophical topics of consolation. I shall conclude this subject with observing that, though virtue be undoubtedly the best choice, when it is attainable, yet such is the disorder and confusion of human affairs, that no perfect or regular distribution of happiness and misery is ever in this life to be expected. Not only the goods of fortune and the endowments of the body, both of which are important, not only these advantages, I say, are unequally divided between the virtuous and vicious, but even the mind itself partakes, in some degree, of this disorder, and the most worthy character, by the very constitution of the passions, enjoys not always the highest felicity. It is observable that, though every bodily pain proceeds from some disorder in the part or organ, yet the pain is not always proportioned to the disorder, but is greater or less, according to the greater or less sensibility of the part, upon which the noxious humors exert their influence. A toothache produces more violent convulsions of pain than a phthisis or a dropsy. In like manner, with regard to the economy of the mind, we may observe that all vice is indeed pernicious, yet the disturbance or pain is not measured out by nature with exact proportion to the degree of vice, nor is the man of highest virtue, even abstracting from external accidents, always the most happy. A gloomy and melancholy disposition is certainly, to our sentiments, a vice or imperfection, but as it may be accompanied with great sense of honor and great integrity, it may be found in very worthy characters, though it is sufficient alone to embitter life and render the person affected with it completely miserable. On the other hand, a selfish villain may possess a spring and alacrity of temper, a certain gaiety of heart, which is indeed a good quality, but which is rewarded much beyond its merit, and when attended with good fortune, will compensate for the uneasiness and remorse arising from all the other vices. I shall add, as an observation to the same purpose, that, if a man be liable to a vice or imperfection, it may often happen that a good quality, which he possesses along with it, will render him more miserable than if he were completely vicious. A person of such imbecility of temper as to be easily broken by affliction is more unhappy for being endowed with a generous and friendly disposition, which gives him a lively concern for others, and exposes him the more to fortune and accidents. A sense of shame in an imperfect character is certainly a virtue, but produces great uneasiness and remorse, from which the abandoned villain is entirely free. A very amorous complexion, with a heart incapable of friendship, is happier than the same excess in love. With a generosity of temper which transports a man beyond himself, and renders him a total slave to the object of his passion. In a word, human life is more governed by fortune than by reason, is to be regarded more as a dull pastime than as a serious occupation, and is more influenced by particular humor than by general principles. Shall we engage ourselves in it with passion and anxiety? It is not worthy of so much concern. Shall we be indifferent about what happens? We lose all the pleasure of the game by our phlegm and carelessness. While we are reasoning concerning life, life is gone. And death, though perhaps they receive him differently, yet treats alike the fool and the philosopher. To reduce life to exact rule and method is commonly a painful, oft a fruitless occupation. And is it not also a proof that we overvalue the prize for which we contend? Even to reason so carefully concerning it, and to fix with accuracy its just idea, would be overvaluing it, were it not that to some tempers this occupation is one of the most amusing in which life could possibly be employed. Were I not afraid of appearing too philosophical, I should remind my reader of that famous doctrine, supposed to be fully proved in modern times, that tastes and colors, and all other sensible qualities, lie not in the bodies, but merely in the senses. The case is the same with beauty and deformity, virtue and vice. This doctrine, however, takes off no more from the reality of the latter qualities than from that of the former, nor need it give any umbrage either to critics or moralists. Though colors were allowed to lie only in the eye, would dyers or painters ever be less regarded or esteemed? There is a sufficient uniformity in the senses and feelings of mankind to make all these qualities the objects of art and reasoning, and to have the greatest influence on life and manners. And as it is certain that the discovery above mentioned in natural philosophy makes no alteration on action and conduct, why should a like discovery in moral philosophy make any alteration? The skeptic, perhaps, carries the matter too far when he limits all philosophical topics and reflections to these two. There seem to be others, whose truth is undeniable, and whose natural tendency is to tranquilize and soften all the passions. Philosophy greedily seizes these, studies them, weighs them, commits them to the memory, and familiarizes them to the mind. And their influence on tempers, which are thoughtful, gentle, and moderate, may be considerable. But what is their influence, you will say, if the temper be antecedently disposed after the same manner as that to which they pretend to form it? They may, at least, fortify that temper, and furnish it with views by which it may entertain and nourish itself. Here are a few examples of such philosophical reflections. Is it not certain that every condition has concealed ills? Then why envy any body? Everyone has known ills, and there is a compensation throughout. Why not be contented with the present? Custom deadens the sense both of the good and the ill, and levels everything, health and humor all. The rest of little consequence, except these be affected. How many other good things have I? Then why be vexed for one ill? How many are happy in the condition of which I complain? How many envy me? Every good must be paid for, fortune by labor, favor by flattery. Would I keep the price, yet have the commodity? Expect not too great happiness in life. Human nature admits it not. Propose not a happiness too complicated. But does that depend on me? Yes, the first choice does. Life is like a game. One may choose the game, and passion by degrees seizes the proper object. Anticipate by your hopes and fancy future consolation, which time infallibly brings to every affliction. I desire to be rich. Why? That I may possess many fine objects, houses, gardens, equipage, etc. How many fine objects does nature offer to everyone without expense? If enjoyed, sufficient. If not, see the effect of custom or of temper, which would soon take off the relish of the riches. I desire fame. Let this occur. If I act well, I shall have the esteem of all my acquaintance, and what is all the rest to me? These reflections are so obvious that it is a wonder they occur not to every man, so convincing that it is a wonder they persuade not every man. But perhaps they do occur to and persuade most men when they consider human life by a general and calm survey. But where any real, affecting incident happens, when passion is awakened, fancy agitated, example draws, and counsel urges, the philosopher is lost in the man, and he seeks in vain for that persuasion which before seemed so firm and unshaken. What remedy for this inconvenience? Assist yourself by a frequent perusal of the entertaining moralists. Have recourse to the learning of Plutarch, the imagination of Lucian, the eloquence of Cicero, the wit of Seneca, the gaiety of Montaigne, the sublimity of Shaftesbury. Moral precepts so couched strike deep and fortify the mind against the illusions of passion. But trust not altogether to external aid. By habit and study acquire that philosophical temper which both gives force to reflection, and by rendering a great part of your happiness independent, takes off the edge from all disorderly passions, and tranquilizes the mind. Despise not these helps, but confide not too much in them neither, unless nature has been favorable in the temper with which she has endowed you,